pretty open. So then if we think about implementing privacy by design, the first and the most important thing is that we have a very significant tool available to us, which is a risk and compliance assessment. And there's another section on risk and compliance. We'll do a workshop on risk and compliance assessments, which are data protection impact assessments. We'll do a workshop on those, and it's a bit more interactive than this workshop. So and not as much of a dump of information, a bit more kind of thinking through stuff and looking at stuff from your point of view. So it'll be a little bit easier to sit through. So So I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm not going to go into any detail about that right now, because hopefully any of you who will need to do this will come along to that workshop. What we're looking at here is the framework. So we have for the security part, we're looking at the ISO 27001, and then for the privacy part, there's a 29100 privacy framework, 2011. And so between those, there's a number of techniques of data handling techniques and data security techniques. Now, you're all 27001 compliant, so I'm not going to go into that, apart from, oh yes, I do want to mention before I go into talking about the frameworks, this is a little bit of step away in a different direction, but if we look at the OWASP, the Open Web App Security Project, they categorized the top 10 privacy risks back in 2015. It's about 2 years ago, and they did a big global study. They went out to a lot of internet security experts, and they said, what do you see as being the top risks? And this is what they came with. They also categorized the top 20, but I couldn't fit them on one slide, so I stuck with the top 10. So this is what they see as being the top risks to web privacy. And the interesting thing here, if I can click through, is that these four, P1, P2, P9, and P10, absolutely security. You put security in place, you've sorted them. These P3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are privacy risks. So I think this highlights the fact that you can put security, you can put security measures in place, but they're not addressing all of the risks that are out there in terms of processing personal data. And you're missing, if you don't put privacy risks in place, you're missing out on a lot of the risks. And this one, P3, I'm not going to talk through all of them, but this one I find really interesting, because we've seen this in the news, these massive big data breaches, and companies sit on them for 6 months or a year or 2 years, and they make the breach worse. And not only do they make that data breach worse, but they enable the next data breach to happen, because a password that is stolen from somebody during one data breach can be used in, the person isn't aware, they don't update their passwords, and then that password is used to breach another system. So those breaches kind of, the fact that of the insufficient data breach response, they kind of propagate other breaches as well. So it's just looking at privacy, at security isn't enough. You do have to look at privacy, and you have to look at privacy practices as well. And so I just think that that's an interesting thing to look at. So when we're talking about the frameworks, then the ICT security, you're talking about the CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. The privacy specific, you're looking at unlinkability, transparency, and intervenability. And I'm just going to talk about what those three mean at a very, very high level. And then hopefully that'll be enough that some of you will be interested, and you'll go away and you look for more information about them. And if you're looking for more information about them, there's a really good paper on software engineering for privacy by design, which is written by ENISA, which is the European Network Information Security Association. And they published a paper, I think around 2012, and they've republished it, they've updated it and republished it recently. And that's where they discuss these techniques of unlinkability, transparency, and intervenability. And it's the best technical resource I've come across. So privacy by design is still a little bit immature when you get into the technical field. Certainly when you look at ISO 27001 and then you look at ISO 29100, there's a huge difference in terms of the maturity of that of the practices that are in there. So that ANISA paper is worth looking at. So unlinkability means that privacy relevant data cannot be linked across domains. And it's all about keeping data separate. If it's for different purposes, keep it separate. So you avoid collecting data in certain circumstances. Separation of context, the example I like to use, because it's a kind of an obvious one. You go into hospital and you're being checked into the hospital, and the admin person comes down and they want to know your name and address, and you're next of kin, and they want to know how you're going to pay. That's the most important piece of information, is how you're going to pay. Have you private health insurance? Are you giving me a credit card? How am I going to bill you for this? So they need to know that. Then the doctor comes along and the doctor wants to know what's your temperature and what's wrong with you, and have you a pain in your tummy, or why are you here? And because they need to fix you. So the person, the hospital admin, doesn't need to know your temperature, and the doctor doesn't need to know your credit card number. So you separate that information. You don't actually, store them in the same database. You don't allow the same people to see them. And in Ireland, our hospital information systems are very antiquated, and they're still paper-based, and they're still carried around in big files. And the information about your next of kin and how you're going to pay, and all of your temperature data and all of your symptoms all go carried around with you, and your x-rays and everything in this big thick folder, and it just gets moved around the hospital. And the Irish Health Authority had 133 data breaches last year that they reported. And one of them was a doctor transferring a patient or a couple of patients between two hospitals. And they came out and they were getting in the car, and Irish weather, it was wet and windy, and they've a cup of coffee in one hand and the keys in the other hand, and they've the files under their arm, and they just put the files on top. They open the door, they sit into the car, and they drive away, and all the patient data goes all over the place. So that's the one that's just the most obvious for me. But that separation of context is an important technique. Encryption, obviously. Access control is another obvious one, in terms of only the people who need to see it and should see it. Anonymization, which is very difficult to achieve, and early erasure, which is much easier to achieve but much less commonly practiced, shall we say, than it could be. So that's unlinkability. Transparency, this is the concept that privacy relevant data can be understood and reconstructed, that there's a so-called paper trail or an audit trail of the privacy data. So what are you doing? You're logging incidents, you're logging what happens to the data, you're reporting what happens to the data, you're documenting what you do with the data, you're notifying the data subject when something happens to their data, and you're communicating with the data subject. So they're all so things like when somebody changes their password, and you send them a notification to say your password was changed, that's part of a privacy technique, letting people know that something has happened, so that if it shouldn't have happened, it can be corrected. That's the transparency. Intervenability. It should be possible to intervene on an ongoing or planned privacy relevant data processing activity. So you should be able to influence the activity, you should be able to stop it, you should be able to manually override automated decisions, you should be looking at data portability. And I was talking to Ellen, and she said, you guys are really good on data portability. If somebody's that it's not going to be an issue for you, because if somebody is leaving you and going to a competitor, you have a policy of being able to produce all the data back to them within 20 days or within 30 days in a standardized format. So that's the data portability. And then user settings, and that's really allowing the user to set their to determine their own settings. That's the example I gave of the browser setting. For the e-privacy regulation, where we set our cookie preferences in our browser, and then the browser, as we go through the internet, the browser will communicate those settings with websites for us. So that's intervenability. So we're almost there now. So then the strategies. again, there's a little bit of repetition in here between, because this is the 29-100 what it says that we should do, and then this comes from ENISA actually, and it's just a set of strategies, high-level strategies that you can use. So you can minimize the amount of personal data that you collect. You can hide the personal data, and the example I would have there is in banking systems. Banks are required to collect people's tax identification numbers, and it's for the purposes of this anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist activity tracking. And so banks must, they must do a lot of reporting for those legislations. And nobody really needs to see that tax information except that tax number, unless there's a money laundering report going in to the tax authorities, or unless there's a tax return being made on their behalf. So it's obstructed from view, it's hidden from view, so that it's not, when the teller is looking at all of your banking history, they don't see that information. So it's, you don't need to present it at all times. Separate, that's distributing your processing, put it in separate compartments. I mean, the hospital is an obvious example of that. And then aggregate, processing at the highest level of aggregation and with the least possible detail. And smart meters would be an example of that. So rather than, when you collect data every 5 minutes from a smart meter, that granularity of information can tell you an awful lot about what's going on in a house. Whereas if you collect that data but you don't keep every 5 minutes worth of data, you aggregate it into a report and store only the aggregated data, there's less information that can be taken from it. So that's the data-oriented strategies. And then you've got process-oriented strategies, which is all about, and you can see common themes coming out here all the time. Inform the data subjects, and provide them control over their data, give them transparency and control, enforce. This is a kind of an important one, having a privacy policy in place and making sure that you follow the policy. So having the policy is enough, is not quite enough. You need to make sure that you follow your policies as well, and then demonstrate. And that's back to the being able to demonstrate compliance and all the tracking of activities that you do in order to demonstrate compliance. One of the reasons why we got you to sign those forms today to say you were here is to demonstrate that you've all received data protection training, and that's part of that path to compliance. So, any questions? Yes?
How does it come, especially the last slide, technically with the engineering team, for example, the hardening, operating system hardening. So is there a guideline, specific guideline that we should follow? Or is it, as you mentioned, for different kind of organization, it can be different and customized to
I think you'll customize it. I think you have to customize it, because if you think about, all the various different software applications, they can be, you can't get a one size fits all, and it will have to be customized. And there are some guidelines out there that you can say, well, actually intervenability makes sense for us because of what we're doing, but maybe, well, transparency will always make sense, but maybe some other techniques, like you might say, like it mentions encryption. End-to-end encryption might not be appropriate for you. It might be way too costly and totally over the top in terms of what's necessary. But you might say, well, we'll just encrypt in this particular case when data is in transit, but we won't do end-to-end encryption. And I think that's all, the whole thing will come back to that risk and compliance thing. So you have to look at your risks, and then you decide what's the appropriate response to those risks. And these are the techniques that are available to us. So which of these techniques are appropriate to the risks that we have identified?
So usually organizations use the Center of Internet Security guideline to protect the operating system.
Yeah.
So there are other that use FIPS and different kind of guidelines.
Yeah.
So what GDPR would recommend for our kind of organization, which is oriented to internet software?
So there's a couple of sources of information. One is that there's a Working Party 29 group in Europe, and that group is the supervisory authorities in Europe, And what they do is they come together and they work on various aspects of GDPR, and they provide guidances to say, you know, when you're doing this kind of thing, this is what we expect you to do. And they will consult, and they have a paper on cloud computing, for instance. And so they do consult with the industry when they're putting those guidances together. So that's a Working Party 29 is a good source of information. And then the other source of information for this particular thing that I think is worth using is the ENISA, ENISA, which is the European Network Information Security Authority, and they do work on privacy by design, but it's still immature. You know, the whole area of privacy by design, it's not like security. It hasn't been around for that long, and it hasn't been in practice in software companies for that long. So it's going to be another few years before it really gets mature. I think an awful lot of what you're doing at the moment will be, you know, figuring it out for yourselves, using some of the resources that are out there, and interpreting them, and then deciding what's appropriate for yourselves.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? I'm on to my second last slide. So your opportunity for questions is okay. All right. So the last slide is so we looked at there's the operational techniques and there's technical techniques there. And my kind of rule of thumb is that the technical methodologies they're the techniques that you look at when you're in your product design. And you know, that's what you're looking at embedding into the product. But then the operational techniques and the operational activities are the supporting activities that you think about when you're selling your product and when you're marketing your product and when you're deploying it and when you're supporting the product. And that's kind of my rule of thumb for when you apply what techniques. And you can't just think about product design. You have to think about how are we getting that product out to market, and are we going to be compliant getting that product out to market and supporting it, as well as when we're actually designing it and developing it. So that's it. I forgot to put up a thank you slide.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Will you please